Dissolution is usually mistaken for destruction because the mind is trained to equate loss of structure with loss of value. When something falls away quickly, the reflex is to assume damage has occurred, that an error has been made, or that a force has arrived to undo what was carefully built. But dissolution tones do not arrive as attackers. They arrive as solvents. They do not break what is true. They loosen what was only ever held together by effort, repetition, or borrowed coherence. What dissolves under these tones is not removed by force. It releases itself because it was never stable on its own. This is why dissolution often feels quiet rather than violent, even when the consequences are dramatic. The tone does not announce itself. It simply withdraws the energetic pressure that was keeping false structure upright. And what remains standing afterward reveals what was actually load-bearing. Most identities are not constructed once. They are reinforced daily through memory, expectation, and social mirroring. A belief does not survive because it is accurate. It survives because it is repeated in enough environments to feel self-evident. Dissolution tones interrupt this repetition loop. They do not argue with the belief. They do not replace it with a better idea. They remove the ambient reinforcement that kept it unquestioned. When that reinforcement fades, the belief does not shatter. It loses density. It becomes porous. Thoughts that once felt solid begin to feel optional. Emotional reactions that once felt mandatory begin to hesitate. This hesitation is the first signal of dissolution, not collapse, but slack. The moment when the psyche realizes it no longer needs to tense in order to remain intact. Valendrunath is not a destroyer of form. He is a dissolver of scaffolding. Scaffolding exists to support construction, not to become the building itself. False identity scaffolding remains in place long after its function has expired because it becomes mistaken for the structure it once served. Dissolution tones target this confusion. They make the scaffolding transparent. They reveal which internal supports were meant to be temporary, but were never removed. This is why dissolution feels like exposure rather than attack. Nothing new is imposed. What was hidden by oversupport is suddenly visible. The self does not lose substance. It loses unnecessary reinforcement. One of the most destabilizing aspects of dissolution is that it does not reward endurance. There is no sense of earning clarity through suffering. The tone does not respond to willpower, it responds to release. Structures maintained by tension dissolve first. Structures maintained by truth remain. This creates a disorienting inversion of value. The parts of identity that required the most effort to uphold are the first to fade, while the parts that required no defense remain untouched. This can feel unfair to the mind that equates effort with worth. It can feel like a betrayal of discipline, of sacrifice, of the story that struggle was necessary to deserve coherence. Dissolution tones quietly contradict that story by demonstrating that what is real does not require maintenance. Emotionally, dissolution tones do not produce catharsis. They produce neutrality. A reaction that once carried charge simply stops activating. A narrative that once demanded resolution no longer feels urgent. This absence of urgency can be mistaken for numbness, but it is not a loss of feeling. It is a loss of compulsion. Feeling remains, but it is no longer hijacked by identity defense. This is unsettling because many people rely on emotional intensity as proof of aliveness. When the intensity fades, they fear emptiness. What they are actually encountering is unoccupied awareness. Space that was previously filled with self-management becomes available. This availability can feel unfamiliar enough to register as absence, even though nothing essential has been removed. Cognitively, dissolution tones interrupt certainty without introducing confusion. Thoughts still arise, reason still functions, but the internal pressure to conclude weakens. Questions remain open longer, interpretations feel provisional. The mind is no longer forced to close loops prematurely to preserve identity coherence. This is not a loss of intelligence. It is a shift from defensive cognition to exploratory cognition. The destabilization comes from realizing how often certainty was used as a stabilizer rather than a truth. When certainty dissolves, clarity does not immediately replace it. Instead, there is suspension, a holding pattern where understanding is allowed to remain incomplete without triggering threat responses. This suspension is uncomfortable for systems trained to equate not knowing with danger. Relationally, dissolution tones expose where connection was maintained through role rather than presence. When a role dissolves, relationships reorganize or fall silent. This is often interpreted as loss, but it is more accurately a recalibration. Interactions that depended on fixed identity positions lose traction. Interactions that were based on resonance deepen without effort. The destabilization here is subtle but profound. It challenges the assumption that continuity equals health. Some connections persist because they are true. Others persist because they are habitual. Dissolution tones do not judge which is which. They simply remove the energetic glue that kept habit masquerading as bond. The most dangerous misunderstanding of dissolution is the belief that it is a phase to be endured before something better arrives. This framing turns dissolution into a tunnel rather than a state change. It encourages resistance, endurance, and future orientation. Dissolution tones do not move forward. They move inward. They collapse excess, not to punish, but to free capacity. When treated as a temporary ordeal, dissolution feels endless. When treated as a structural reconfiguration, it becomes intelligible. The discomfort does not come from what is happening. It comes from the attempt to preserve what the tone is already dissolving. Dissolution precedes expansion, not by clearing space, but by removing distortion. Expansion that occurs without dissolution amplifies false structure. It increases complexity without coherence. Dissolution tones prevent this by ensuring that only what can stand without reinforcement is carried forward. This is why the tone often arrives after periods of growth. It is not regression, it is filtration. The system sheds what it cannot integrate sustainably. The fear that accompanies this shedding comes from misidentifying accumulation as progress. Dissolution reveals that progress is not additive, it is selective. What makes dissolution particularly disorienting is that it does not provide immediate replacement structures. The mind expects transition to include substitution. When one identity loosens, another should appear. When one belief fades, a better one should take its place. Dissolution refuses this economy. It creates a gap, a span where structure has thinned, but new form has not yet condensed. This gap is not a mistake. It is the condition that allows reorganization to occur without copying previous patterns. The instability is intentional. It prevents premature reconstruction. It forces the system to experience coherence without scaffolding. This is why dissolution tones are often misdiagnosed as loss of purpose. Purpose that was derived from role collapses when the role dissolves. What remains is direction without narrative, movement without story. This can feel meaningless to systems trained to equate meaning with explanation. Dissolution reveals a deeper function of purpose, one that operates prior to articulation. The discomfort arises because this function cannot yet be named without reintroducing false structure. The tone holds the system in unnamed alignment until articulation can emerge without distortion. Velen Druneth operates at this threshold. He does not guide toward answers. He dissolves the conditions that made the wrong answers feel necessary. His influence is felt most strongly where identity was performing coherence rather than embodying it. Under his tone, performance loses energy. Authentic alignment gains gravity. The system begins to reorganize, not around who it claims to be, but around what it can sustain without effort. This reorganization is not immediate. It unfolds through silence, through pauses in reaction, through moments where nothing needs to be decided. The first teaching of Dissolution Tones is not that you are becoming something new. It is that you are no longer required to maintain what was never true. This realization does not arrive as relief. It arrives as destabilization, because it removes familiar effort. The system must learn how to exist without constant self-reinforcement. This learning cannot be rushed. It cannot be reasoned into place. It occurs through repeated exposure to the fact that nothing collapses when the false supports are gone. The building remains, only the scaffolding dissolves. The first lie dissolution exposes is not that you were wrong, but that you were safe because you could explain yourself. You believed the scaffolding was separate from the building, and that once you spotted the temporary supports, you could remove them cleanly. But dissolution tones do not respect the neat categories the mind uses to stay calm. They do not ask permission before crossing the boundary between support and structure, because that boundary is often imaginary. What you called the building may have been a story you rehearsed until it felt load-bearing. What you called the core may have been a role reinforced by fear. Dissolution begins by proving that your confidence about what is essential is not evidence of essence. It is evidence of repetition. When the solvent deepens, you discover something more unsettling than collapse. You discover that you cannot always tell what is dissolving while it is dissolving. The mind expects a clear target, a clear flaw, a clear reason, and then a clean release. But dissolution tones do not operate by targeting single beliefs. They operate by changing the conditions that made the entire system interpret itself the same way. You can watch a behavior fall away and still not know what part of you used it as a brace. You can watch a relationship quiet down and still not know which part of your identity required the dynamic to remain stable. The destabilization comes from realizing that awareness does not automatically confer control, and the tone does not negotiate with your need to manage the process. A second lie dissolves next, quieter and more humiliating. You assumed that what was true would remain standing without effort. You assumed that endurance was proof of authenticity. But many false structures persist precisely because they are reinforced by external systems, by social reward, by fear of consequence, by the comfort of familiarity. They stand not because they are true, but because they are subsidized. Dissolution tones remove the subsidy, and the mind panics because it had confused subsidy with strength. This is why the collapse can include things you admired in yourself. It can include traits you built your reputation on. It can include your sense of being the stable one, the capable one, the wise one, the one who handles it. The tone does not care how noble the mask felt. Emotionally, the pressure shifts from dramatic pain to something harder to interpret. The sensation is not heartbreak, it is unhooking. You reach for a familiar reaction and it does not arrive on time. You attempt to generate urgency and it feels staged. You try to perform motivation and your system refuses the performance. This can feel like depression, but it is not a descent into darkness. It is a collapse of borrowed heat. You begin to see how often intensity was used as fuel, and you begin to fear that without intensity, you will not move at all. The tone does not rush to reassure you, because the question is not whether you will move, the question is whether movement without compulsion is possible. Then comes the deeper destabilization, the recognition that some suffering was not imposed, it was maintained, not consciously, not with cruelty, but with loyalty. You held certain pains because they proved something, because they justified certain identities, because they made the past feel coherent. Dissolution tones begin to dissolve that loyalty. and the psyche reacts as if a sacred contract is being violated. You can feel guilt when relief arrives. You can feel disoriented when a wound stops defining you. You can even feel anger at the quietness, because quietness offers no narrative payoff. This is where many people rebuild quickly, not because they want to be false, but because they cannot tolerate a self that does not earn its place through struggle. Cognitively, dissolution tones do not simply remove beliefs, they remove the need to believe in your own explanations. You begin to notice how often you concluded early to avoid the discomfort of not knowing what you were. The mind prefers a flawed story to an open field. Under dissolution, the open field appears and it feels like risk. The mind tries to label it emptiness. The mind tries to label it regression. The mind tries to label it a problem that needs fixing. But the tone keeps dissolving labels by making them feel too small to hold the experience. A thought can still be accurate and still fail to stabilize you. That failure is not confusion. It is the tone teaching your cognition to stop using conclusions as anesthetic. This is the moment the inner countervase appears, not as an enemy, but as a ruthless witness. It asks why you are trying to recover the old coherence instead of letting it die. It asks why you keep calling dissolution a phase, as if the old structure should return when you learn the lesson. It asks whether you actually want truth, or whether you want relief with spiritual language wrapped around it. This is not the voice of self-attack. It is the voice that refuses to collaborate with your self-soothing strategies. It does not fully answer its own questions, because the purpose is not to win an argument. The purpose is to keep you from rebuilding on top of the same foundation. Dissolution tones become dangerous because they remove the social rewards that kept certain versions of you alive. People may not attack you. They may simply stop responding to the old signals. The jokes land differently. The competence display feels flat. The spiritual certainty no longer generates approval. The caretaker position becomes heavy instead of empowering. You begin to feel the outline of how much of yourself was constructed for an audience, even if that audience was imagined. The destabilization is not that people change. It is that you cannot hide from the fact that you used connection as a mirror to confirm your identity. When the mirror fails, you are left with raw presence, and raw presence does not guarantee belonging. This is where the common teaching fails. The common teaching says that when false structure dissolves, true self remains and you feel relief. Sometimes you do not feel relief. Sometimes you feel exposed. Sometimes you feel smaller. Sometimes you feel like a room with furniture removed, and you do not yet know what living looks like without the old objects. The mind calls this emptiness and tries to flee, but the tone is not creating emptiness. It is revealing the spaces you kept filled so you would not have to feel the open question of who you are without reinforcement. The discomfort is not proof of failure. It is proof that the old strategy was to fill rather than to inhabit. At this depth, Velindrunath becomes less like a gentle solvent. He dissolves not only what is obviously false, but what is subtly performative. Even your language about growth can become a scaffold. Even your commitment to truth can become a badge. Even your insistence on authenticity can become a structure you maintain to avoid the vulnerability of being ordinary. Dissolution tones begin to erode the aesthetic of awakening. They erode the identity of being someone who sees clearly. They erode the need to be the one who understands. This is where people resist hardest, because the ego can survive loss of pain more easily than it can survive loss of superiority. A third lie dissolves next, the belief that you can choose the timeline of your transformation. The mind wants pacing. The mind wants stages. The mind wants a map. Under dissolution, maps fall apart because the terrain itself is changing. You may feel fine one day and unrecognizable the next, not because you regressed, but because a support beam finally released. You may experience bursts of clarity, followed by a strange dullness, not because clarity was false, but because the system refuses to stabilize too soon. Stabilization would become a new scaffold. The tone protects the process by keeping it unresolved long enough for deeper reorganization to occur beneath conscious narration. Notice how quickly the mind tries to bargain here. It says it will let go of certain habits if it can keep certain identities. It says it will stop certain behaviors if it can keep certain relationships. It says it will release certain fears if it can keep its story about being a good person. Dissolution tones do not negotiate with bargains because bargains are still control strategies. They are still the mind trying to curate which parts of the self survive. The solvent keeps working. It keeps loosening. It keeps thinning the glue. This is why dissolution can feel like betrayal, because it refuses to protect the version of you that made you feel acceptable. The most destabilizing truth is that you can rebuild perfectly and still rebuild falsely. You can construct a new routine, a new identity, a new spiritual framework, and it can be beautiful, and it can still be scaffolding. Dissolution tones, therefore, do not only remove what is old, they also attack premature reconstruction. They make new structures feel brittle. They make new language feel hollow. They make new certainty feel too smooth. This is not cruelty, it is precision. The tone is training you to recognize the difference between coherence that emerges and coherence that is performed. The difference is subtle, and the mind hates subtle differences because it cannot prove them quickly. At this point, the question shifts from what is dissolving to what in you is addicted to structure. There is a part of the psyche that does not actually want truth. It wants predictability. It wants a stable narrative to minimize surprise. Dissolution tones expose this addiction by removing predictability and forcing you to meet reality without rehearsal. You begin to notice how often you lived in anticipation, how often you planned emotional responses, how often you prepared defenses, how often you rehearsed explanations. Under dissolution, rehearsal becomes impossible because the old cues no longer activate. You are left with direct contact, and direct contact is unstable because it requires presence rather than strategy. Presence itself becomes a new pressure. You cannot hide behind intensity. You cannot hide behind certainty. You cannot hide behind roles. You cannot hide behind helpfulness. You cannot even hide behind the idea that you are surrendering, because surrender can become a performance too. This is why dissolution tones can feel like a stripping, because they are. Not stripping your soul, stripping your methods. Not stripping your value, stripping your defenses. But the mind experiences the loss of defenses as the loss of self, because it has lived inside defense for so long that it forgot the difference between protection and identity. Some people attempt to resolve this by calling it a dark night, by giving it a familiar mythic container. That container can help, but it can also become a trap. If you label the process too quickly, you give yourself a script. Scripts reduce attention. Scripts produce shortcuts. The tone resists scripts by keeping the experience slightly outside the label. It keeps the discomfort alive long enough to force genuine learning. The learning is not intellectual. The learning is somatic. It is the body discovering that it can remain intact without the old bracing. It is the nervous system discovering that it can tolerate the open field without collapsing into panic. In the deepest layers, dissolution tones challenge the assumption that freedom feels good immediately. Freedom can feel like loss because it removes the familiar boundaries that defined your movement. When certain constraints dissolve, you realize you were using them as orientation points. Their removal creates vertigo. The mind asks for walls, not because it loves prison, but because it loves reference. Dissolution tones do not rebuild the walls. They teach you to orient through resonance instead of constraint. That teaching is slow. It cannot be rushed by motivation. It cannot be rushed by analysis. It unfolds as the system begins to recognize its own truth signals without needing a narrative to justify them. Here, Velindrunath reveals his real function. He is not a cleaner of obvious illusions. He is a calibrator of what can exist without self-deception. Under his tone, you are not asked to become better. You are asked to become unheld. You are asked to see what remains when you stop propping yourself up with stories, with fear, with performance, with borrowed significance. This is why dissolution is often followed by a strange simplicity that feels almost insulting. The mind expects a grand revelation. The tone offers a quiet recalibration. The insult is to the ego, because the ego wanted drama as proof that something important happened. Even then, the process does not conclude cleanly. Dissolution tones do not grant finality, because finality is another scaffold. They leave you with a new kind of question, sharper than the old ones. If you can survive without the identities you defended, what else have you defended that was never necessary? If you can remain present without the intensity you relied on, what kind of life could you live without compulsion? If you can relate without roles, what kind of connection remains when no one is performing? The tone does not answer these questions quickly. It leaves them humming, unresolved. Because the hum itself is the pressure that keeps you honest. This is the threshold where many people try to return to the earlier understanding. The comforting idea that the building remains and only scaffolding falls away. But the deeper truth is more demanding. Sometimes what you called the building was scaffolding too. Sometimes your pride was a brace. Sometimes your certainty was a prop. Sometimes your morality was a costume stitched from fear of rejection. Dissolution tones do not shame you for this. They simply refuse to let you carry it forward. They dissolve the hidden supports and force you to meet what you actually are beneath all support. And that encounter does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as contact. Contact is the beginning, not the conclusion. It is the moment you realize that what dissolves was never you, but you still do not know what you are without it. It is the space where the next coherence either condenses truthfully or collapses again.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.